Chapter 1. The Binding Chain. Lyra didn't know that the man she was about to humiliate with her clumsiness would destroy everything she thought she understood about her place in this world. She didn't know that his simple travelling clothes concealed the most powerful alpha in the 7 kingdoms. And she certainly didn't know that when their eyes met across Lord Vance's glittering ballroom, something golden and impossible would snap into place between them, like the final piece of a puzzle she'd never known was incomplete. The silver collar around her throat felt heavier tonight. It always did during the grand summits, when Lord Vance paraded his wealth before the visiting dignitaries, and she became just another ornament in his collection. The metal was warm against her skin, heated by her nervous breathing as she navigated between clusters of lords and ladies with her tray of crystal wine glasses. "Move faster!" hissed Marcus, Lord Vance's head steward, as she passed the servants' station. "The Alpha King's delegation just arrived, and his lordship wants every glass filled before they finish their greetings." Lyra's step quickened. The Alpha King himself, here in their remote mountain territory. She'd heard whispers about Kieran Blackwood since childhood. Stories of a ruler so fierce that enemies surrendered rather than face his wrath, so commanding that even the ancient bloodline families bent their knees without question. Lord Vance had been preparing for months, polishing every surface, drilling every servant, desperate to impress the legendary monarch. She shouldn't care about politics, shouldn't care about anything beyond completing her duties and avoiding Vance's displeasure. But something in her chest stirred with curiosity as she wound through the crowd, catching fragments of conversation about the mysterious king who ruled from the eastern reaches. "They say he's never taken a mate," one lady whispered behind her fan, "refuses every alliance marriage offered to him." "Probably waiting for someone worthy of his standards," another replied. "Though who could possibly be worthy of a king like that?" No one, Lyra thought automatically. The golden cage around her ribs tightened. She'd learned long ago that worthiness wasn't meant for girls like her. Girls who belonged to men like Lord Vance. Girls who wore collars instead of crowns. The crowd near the great hearth was thicker than usual, voices rising in animated discussion. Lyra approached carefully, balancing her tray as she prepared to offer wine to the gathered nobles. She'd done this 1,000 times. Smooth approach, polite offer, graceful retreat. Simple. She spotted her target, a man standing with his back to her at the edge of the group. His clothes marked him as a traveller rather than nobility. Simple dark leathers instead of silk and jewels. Probably a bodyguard or advisor to one of the visiting lords, safe enough to approach. "Wine, sir," Lyra murmured softly, stepping closer with her tray extended. He turned. Everything inside her went utterly, impossibly still. Golden eyes met hers across the space of a heartbeat, and the world shifted on its axis. They were the colour of molten amber, of autumn sunlight, of flames dancing in the darkness. But it wasn't just their beauty that stole her breath. It was the way he looked at her, really looked, as if she were something precious instead of invisible, as if she mattered. Something warm and bright flared to life in her chest, a golden thread she'd never felt before. It pulled tight between them, connecting her to this stranger in a way that defied all logic. She could feel his presence like a second heartbeat, could sense something wild and powerful just beneath his calm exterior. "Mine," whispered a voice in the deepest part of her soul. "Mine! No! Impossible!" She belonged to Lord Vance, had belonged to him since her father's debt put chains around her wrists and a contract around her future. She couldn't belong to anyone else, didn't deserve to. "Careful," the stranger said quietly, and she realized she was trembling. The wine glasses chimed softly against each other on her tray. His voice was deep, warm like whiskey and honey. It made something in her chest ache with longing. Forgive me," she stammered, trying to steady herself. "Would you like some wine?" He studied her face with an intensity that made her knees weak. There was something ancient in his gaze, something that spoke of power and patience and promises she couldn't begin to understand. When his lips curved in the softest suggestion of a smile, her heart forgot how to beat properly. "What I would like," he said, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear, "is to know why someone put fear in your eyes." The question hit her like a physical blow. She took an involuntary step backward, and her foot caught on the edge of a thick carpet. Time slowed as she felt herself falling, the tray tilting, crystal glasses sliding toward disaster. Strong hands caught her arms before she could hit the ground, before the wine could spill, before humiliation could rain down on both of them in a cascade of broken glass and red stains. He pulled her upright with impossible gentleness, his hands warm even through the fabric of her sleeves. For one perfect moment she was pressed against his chest, surrounded by his scent, pine and storm and something uniquely, devastatingly male. The golden thread between them blazed so brightly she gasped. "Easy," he murmured, his breath warm against her temple. "You're safe." Safe. When was the last time anyone had called her safe? "Lyra!" Lord Vance's voice cut through the moment like a blade. "What is the meaning of this?" The stranger's hands tightened on her arms for just an instant before he released her and stepped back. Lyra spun toward her master, her face burning with shame and something else, disappointment that the moment of impossible warmth was over. Lord Vance stalked toward them, his dark eyes promising punishment. He was a handsome man by most standards, with sharp cheekbones and perfectly styled black hair, but there was something cold in his beauty, something that made her skin crawl even after 3 years of servitude. "Forgive my property's clumsiness, stranger," Vance said, his voice smooth as silk and twice as dangerous. His fingers closed around Lyra's wrist with bruising force, dragging her away from the man who'd saved her from falling. "She'll be properly disciplined for this embarrassment." Property. The word hit her like a slap, a reminder of what she was, what she'd always be. But the stranger's eyes flashed with something that looked almost like anger. His jaw tightened as he watched Vance's grip on her wrist. "No harm done," the stranger said carefully. "Accidents happen." "Not with my servants," Vance replied with a laugh that made Lyra's blood run cold. "She knows better, don't you, pet?" The golden-eyed stranger's gaze never left her face. Something passed between them in that look, a promise, a question, a possibility she didn't dare name. "Yes, my lord," she whispered, because it was the only safe answer, because Lord Vance owned her voice as surely as he owned everything else. But as Vance dragged her away from the warmth and possibility of those amber eyes, something inside her rebelled for the first time in 3 years. The golden thread stretched but didn't break, connecting her to the stranger across an ocean of silk and jewels and political games. She looked back once, just before Vance pulled her through the servants' entrance. The stranger was watching her go with an expression she couldn't read, but his hands were clenched into fists at his sides, and something in his stance promised that this wasn't over, not by a long shot. In the kitchens, as Lord Vance's lecture about proper behaviour and appropriate punishment washed over her, Lyra touched her fingers to her chest, where the golden warmth still pulsed. She didn't understand what had happened in that ballroom, didn't understand why a simple stranger had looked at her like she was worth something. But for the first time in 3 years of servitude, she wanted to understand, wanted to believe that maybe, possibly, she could be more than just Lord Vance's property, even if believing it terrified her more than his threats ever could. Chapter 2. The King's Pursuit. The silver collar felt like a noose around Lyra's throat as Lord Vance dragged her through the corridors toward his private chambers. Her wrist throbbed where his fingers had dug in, but the pain was nothing compared to the humiliation burning in her chest. 3 years of perfect service, and she'd ruined it all by staring into a stranger's golden eyes like some lovesick fool. "Sit," Vance commanded, releasing her so abruptly she stumbled. His chambers were opulent in their darkness, black silk drapes, obsidian furniture, silver accents that caught the firelight like knives, everything chosen to intimidate, to remind visitors of his wealth and power. Lyra sank to her knees on the thick carpet, hands folded in her lap, eyes downcast. The position had been beaten into her muscle memory during her first months of service. Submit, apologize, accept punishment, survive. Look at me. She raised her eyes to find Vance pacing before the fireplace, his handsome face twisted with fury. When he was angry like this, the resemblance to his father became more pronounced. The same cruel mouth, the same calculating eyes that saw people as possessions to be acquired and discarded. 3 years, he said softly, and somehow the quiet tone was more terrifying than shouting. 3 years I've invested in training you, teaching you proper behaviour, making you useful, and you repay that investment by throwing yourself at the first stranger who shows you kindness? My lord, I didn't. Silence. The word cracked like a whip. I saw how you looked at him, saw how you trembled in his arms like some untouched maiden instead of the broken little slave you are. Each word landed like a physical blow, reinforcing the lessons she'd learned through pain and repetition. She was nothing, worth nothing, belonged to nothing beyond Vance's pleasure and convenience. But somewhere deep in her chest, that golden warmth still pulsed, a reminder of amber eyes and gentle hands and a voice that had called her safe. You will not disgrace me again, Vance continued, moving to his desk. Perhaps a reminder of your true position will help clarify your priorities. He retrieved a small silver key from a drawer, and Lyra's breath caught. Not the collar. Please, not the collar. But Vance knelt behind her, his breath hot against her neck as he fitted the key to the lock at her throat. Hold still, pet. You know how sharp the edges can be if you move. The collar tightened with a soft click, not enough to restrict breathing, but enough to remind her with every swallow that she belonged to him, that she wore his mark like livestock. Better, Vance murmured, his fingers tracing the silver band with possessive satisfaction. Now you remember what you are. Property, possession, nothing more. But as Lyra knelt there with the collar cutting into her throat and Vance's hands on her shoulders, all she could think about was the way the stranger had looked at her, like she mattered, like she was precious. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, it made something fierce and desperate unfurl in her chest. The next morning brought news that sent the entire household into chaos. Lord Vance stormed through the estate like a man possessed, shouting orders and demanding perfection from every servant. The Alpha King himself had requested a private audience. Not just any audience, he wanted to discuss matters of mutual benefit, and had specifically asked that refreshments be served by the young woman from last evening. Lyra's hands shook as she prepared the tea service, her mind racing. Why would the most powerful Alpha in the 7 kingdoms want to see her? Had she offended him somehow? Was he here to demand punishment for her clumsiness? "Remember your place," Marcus hissed as she balanced the silver tray. "Keep your eyes down, speak only when spoken to, and for the love of the gods, don't drop anything." She nodded, not trusting her voice. The collar felt impossibly heavy as she made her way to Lord Vance's receiving room, each step measured and careful. Through the closed doors she could hear the low rumble of male voices, Vance's sharp and deferential, the other deep and familiar in a way that made her pulse quicken. She knocked softly and waited for permission to enter. "Come." The door swung open to reveal Lord Vance, seated behind his ornate desk, every line of his body radiating tension. Across from him, in a chair that suddenly seemed too small to contain him, sat the stranger from the ballroom. In daylight streaming through the tall windows, he was even more devastating. Dark hair that looked like it had been touched by wind and fingers, a strong jaw shadowed with stubble, and those impossible amber eyes that seemed to see straight through her careful mask of subservience. He wore the same simple travelling clothes, but something about his presence filled the room like barely contained lightning. "Ah, there she is," the stranger said, and his voice sent heat racing through her veins. "The graceful young woman from last evening." Graceful. He called her graceful after she'd nearly destroyed his clothes with her clumsiness. "Set the service here," Lord Vance said sharply, gesturing to a small table between the chairs, "and be quick about it." Lyra moved forward carefully, hyper-aware of every sound the silver and porcelain made. As she bent to arrange the cups, she felt eyes on her, not Vance's calculating gaze, but something warmer, more intense. "What is your name?" the stranger asked quietly. The question wasn't directed at Vance, but her master answered anyway. "She's called Lyra, He caught himself, clearing his throat. "Your lordship, one of my more useful acquisitions." Acquisitions? The word made Lyra's cheeks burn with shame, but she kept her movements steady as she poured tea into delicate porcelain cups. The stranger's eyes never left her face. "Lyra," he repeated as if testing the name. It sounded different in his mouth, like music instead of a command. A beautiful name for a beautiful woman. Her hand trembled and tea splashed onto the saucer. Beautiful. When was the last time anyone had called her beautiful? When was the last time anyone had seen her as anything more than a useful object? "Forgive her clumsiness," Vance said quickly. "She's still learning proper deportment." "I see nothing that requires forgiveness." The stranger's tone was mild, but something in it made Vance shift uncomfortably. "Tell me, Lyra, how long have you served in Lord Vance's household?" The question was addressed directly to her, and she looked to Vance for permission to answer. He nodded curtly. 3 years, sir," she said softly, offering him his cup with steady hands. When their fingers brushed during the exchange, that golden fire flared to life again. He felt it too. She could see it in the way his eyes darkened, the way his breath caught. 3 years, he mused. And before that? Before that? She hesitated, glancing again at Vance. How much was she allowed to say? How much did this stranger really want to know about the daughter of a failed merchant who'd sold her to pay his debts? "Before that, she was nothing," Vance answered for her. "An orphan with nowhere to go and no skills worth mentioning. I gave her purpose, direction, a place in the world." The stranger's amber eyes flashed dangerously. "How generous of you!" There was something in his tone that made Lyra look up sharply, something cold and deadly that seemed completely at odds with his gentle manner from the night before. For just a moment she glimpsed something wild and powerful beneath his calm exterior, like a predator wearing human skin. "I require a personal attendant for the remainder of the summit," the stranger said suddenly, setting down his teacup with deliberate precision. "Someone discreet and efficient. I believe this young woman would serve admirably." Vance's face went pale. "Sir, surely one of my other servants would be more appropriate." "I want her." The words were spoken quietly, but they carried absolute authority. Not a request. A command. Lyra's heart hammered against her ribs. Serve him. Leave the estate, even temporarily. The possibility was terrifying and thrilling in equal measure. "Of course," Vance said through gritted teeth, "whatever you require." "Excellent. She'll come with me now." "Now?" Lyra looked between the two men, panic rising in her throat. "My lord, I have duties." "Your only duty is to serve where you're needed most," the stranger said, rising from his chair with fluid grace. "Pack whatever you require. We leave within the hour." As he moved toward the door, Vance caught his arm. "Forgive me, but I don't believe you've given me your name, sir, for my records." The stranger paused, and when he turned back, his smile was sharp as a blade. "Kieran Blackwood." The name hit the room like a thunderclap. Lyra's legs nearly gave out beneath her, and she heard Vance's sharp intake of breath. Kieran Blackwood, the Alpha King. The most powerful ruler in the 7 kingdoms had been sitting in Vance's parlour, drinking tea from her trembling hands, looking at her like she was something precious instead of property. "Your Majesty," Vance stammered, dropping into a deep bow. "I had no idea. Forgive me." "There's nothing to forgive," King Kieran said mildly. "You've been most hospitable and most illuminating." His eyes found Lyra's across the room, and she saw something in them that made her breath catch. Promise, determination, protection. "I belong to Lord Vance," she whispered, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. It was the truth that had shaped her life for 3 years, the reality that defined her existence. King Kieran's jaw tightened, and when he spoke, his voice was soft as silk and sharp as steel. Not any more. Chapter 3. The Vance Retaliation. The next 3 days passed in a strange haze of confusion and impossible dreams. Lyra found herself installed in guest quarters that were larger than any room she'd ever inhabited. Silk curtains, a 4-poster bed with sheets softer than clouds, and windows that looked out over gardens instead of servants' yards. King Kieran had given her these chambers with casual authority, as if luxury was something she deserved instead of something to be earned through perfect submission. But even paradise felt like a prison when she knew it was temporary. Each morning she attended the king during his meetings with various lords, serving refreshments and standing quietly in corners while he conducted the business of ruling. He never demanded anything more than her presence, never touched her inappropriately, or made her feel like the possession she'd grown accustomed to being. Instead, he asked about her comfort, whether she was eating enough, if she needed anything to feel more at home. Home. As if anywhere could be home for someone like her. "You're very quiet today," he observed on the 3rd afternoon. They were alone in his temporary study, sunlight streaming through tall windows while he reviewed documents that probably determined the fates of kingdoms. "Are you unwell?" Lyra stood with her hands clasped before her, eyes trained on the carpet. "No, Your Majesty, I'm perfectly well." "Look at me." The command was gentle but unmistakable. She raised her eyes to find him watching her with that same intensity that made her feel exposed and precious all at once. He'd abandoned his desk to sit in a chair closer to where she stood, close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his amber eyes. "What's troubling you?" The question was so genuine, so patient, that for a moment she almost forgot herself, almost told him about the fear that had been growing in her chest like a cancer. The knowledge that this beautiful dream would end soon, and she'd be returned to Lord Vance with the memory of kindness to make her punishment worse. "Nothing, Your Majesty," she lied. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Lyra." Her name on his lips still sounded like music, but now there was something commanding beneath the melody, something that demanded truth. She began, then stopped. How could she explain that his kindness was the most beautiful torture she'd ever experienced? That every gentle word made her want things she had no right to want? "Speak freely," he said softly. "I give you my word that nothing you say will be used against you." The promise in his voice undid something inside her. "You'll send me back," she whispered. "When the summit ends, you'll send me back to Lord Vance, and I'll have to pretend that none of this mattered. That being treated like a person instead of property didn't change everything inside me." Something dangerous flashed in his eyes. "Is that what you think?" "It's what I know," she said, desperation making her bold. "I'm nothing, Your Majesty, a debt slave with no family, no value beyond what I can provide in service. Men like you don't keep women like me." He was on his feet before she'd finished speaking, crossing the space between them with predatory grace. She took an involuntary step backward and found herself pressed against the wall, trapped between stone and the overwhelming presence of the most powerful man in 7 kingdoms. "Men like me," he repeated softly, placing one hand on the wall beside her head. "Tell me, Lyra, what kind of man do you think I am?" She couldn't answer, could barely breathe with him this close, his scent wrapping around her like warm honey and pine smoke. The golden thread in her chest pulled so tight it was almost painful, and she could see answering heat in his eyes. "I think," he continued, his voice dropping to something rough and intimate, "that you have no idea what you are to me." His free hand rose to cup her cheek, thumb stroking across her skin with devastating gentleness. "Do you feel this?" he asked. "This pull between us? This impossible connection that defies every law of nature and politics?" She did feel it, had felt it from the moment their eyes met across a crowded ballroom. But feeling it and acknowledging it were two different things. "Your Majesty," "Kieran," he corrected, "when we're alone, I want to hear my name on your lips." The intimacy of that request made her knees weak. Kings didn't ask servants to use their given names. Kings didn't look at slaves like they held the secrets of the universe. "Kieran," she whispered, and watched something fierce and possessive blaze in his amber eyes. "Better." His thumb traced her lower lip, and she shivered at the contact. "Now tell me honestly, do you feel the bond between us?" Bond. The word sent electricity through her veins. In her limited education, she'd learned about mate bonds, the mystical connections that tied alpha souls to their perfect matches. But those were for nobility, for people who mattered, not for girls who wore silver collars and belonged to cruel lords. "I can't," she breathed. "Even if I did, even if this is real, I belong to Lord Vance until my father's debt is paid. There's a contract." "Fuck the contract." The vulgarity shocked her into silence. Kings didn't curse, didn't lose their composure over insignificant servants. "I've seen the terms," Kieran continued, his voice rough with barely controlled emotion. 20,000 gold pieces to be paid in full, or your service continues until death. It's unconscionable, illegal in half the kingdom, and morally repugnant everywhere else. He knew about her father's debt, had looked into the chains that bound her. The knowledge should have humiliated her. Instead, it made something warm unfurl in her chest. He cared enough to investigate, cared enough to understand. "It doesn't matter if it's unconscionable," she said quietly. "It's binding, and even if you could break it, why would you? I'm nobody special, just a broken girl who—" "Don't!" The word cracked like a whip. "Don't you dare diminish yourself in my presence." His other hand came up to frame her face, forcing her to meet his gaze. "You want to know who you are? You're the woman who's haunted my dreams for 3 nights running. You're the person who showed kindness to a stranger when it would have been safer to ignore him. You're brave enough to speak truth to a king and gentle enough to tend wounds without being asked." When had she tended wounds, she started to ask, then remembered. Yesterday, when he'd returned from a ride with a cut on his hand. She'd cleaned and bandaged it without thinking, the way she'd cared for her father's injuries years ago. It had seemed like nothing, a servant's duty, but he'd watched her work with an expression she hadn't understood then, like she was performing a miracle instead of simple first aid. "You're everything," he said quietly, and the words hit her like a physical blow. "And I'm not letting anyone take you away from me. Not Vance, not his damn contract, not your own fears about worthiness." Before she could respond, before she could protest that this was impossible and dangerous and too good to be true, his lips found hers. The kiss was gentle at first, questioning, giving her every opportunity to pull away. But the moment she melted against him, and she did melt like snow in spring sunshine, it deepened into something desperate and claiming. The golden thread between them blazed so brightly she gasped into his mouth. Every nerve ending came alive, every carefully constructed wall around her heart crumbling under the assault of his tenderness. This was what the poets wrote about, what the songs celebrated, this connection that made her feel whole instead of broken. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, she could barely remember her own name. "This is impossible," she whispered against his lips. "Impossible things happen every day," he replied, pressing a soft kiss to her forehead. "Trust me to handle the rest." Trust. Such a simple word, such a complicated concept for someone who'd learned that trust led to chains and collars and years of servitude. But looking into his eyes, those amber depths that saw her as precious instead of worthless, she wanted to try. The moment shattered like glass when the door burst open without warning. "Your Majesty, forgive the interruption, but—" The speaker stopped mid-sentence as he took in the scene. Lyra pressed against the wall, Kieran's hands still framing her face, both of them flushed and breathing hard. Lord Vance stood in the doorway with the expression of cold fury that made her blood freeze in her veins. Behind him, she could see several other lords, their faces ranging from shocked to calculating to openly hostile. "I see," Vance said softly. "How illuminating." Kieran stepped protectively in front of her, but it was too late. The damage was done. They'd been caught in an intimate moment that could be interpreted only one way. "Lord Vance," Kieran said, his voice carrying absolute authority despite the compromising circumstances, "I believe we discussed proper protocols for entering my private chambers." "Indeed we did," Vance replied with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "But when urgent matters arise concerning property that belongs to me, I find myself compelled to act quickly." Property. He was reminding everyone present that she belonged to him, that whatever was happening between her and the king was a violation of his ownership rights. "Perhaps," said Lord Ashford, one of the visiting nobles, "we should discuss this matter more privately. These entanglements can be delicate to navigate." Entanglements, as if her feelings, her bond with Kieran, were nothing more than political complications to be managed. "There's nothing to navigate," Kieran said coldly, "and nothing to discuss." "With respect, Your Majesty," Vance interjected, "there are legal considerations, contractual obligations that cannot simply be ignored regardless of personal preferences." The way he said it made her skin crawl. Like her bond with Kieran was nothing more than a fleeting desire that would pass with time and proper management. "I know exactly what the contract says," Kieran replied, "and I know what it's worth." 20,000 gold pieces, Vance said smoothly, plus interest and penalties for early termination, a considerable sum, even for someone of your resources. The number hung in the air like a weapon. 20,000 gold pieces, more money than most people saw in their lifetimes, more than any sane person would pay for a debt slave with no special skills or connections. Lyra watched the calculation in the other lord's eyes, watched them wonder what madness had possessed their king to desire her so much he'd consider such an enormous expenditure. Watched them begin to see her as a weakness they could exploit. "Of course," Vance continued conversationally, "there are other considerations beyond the financial, questions about the appropriateness of such attachments for a man in your position, the precedent it might set, the message it sends to your subjects about proper behaviour and respect for established contracts." Each word was a carefully placed blade, designed to remind Kieran of his duties, his responsibilities, his reputation. To make him see that wanting her would cost more than money. It would cost political capital he couldn't afford to lose. Something cold settled in her chest as she watched Kieran's expression grow thoughtful. He was a king first, a man second. Had to be, with the weight of 7 kingdoms on his shoulders. And she was asking him to risk all of that for someone who truly was nobody special. "You're right," she said quietly, stepping away from the wall, away from Kieran's protective presence. "Lord Vance is right. I belong to him until my debt is paid. That's the law." "Lyra." "Please don't make this harder than it already is," she whispered, not looking at him. She couldn't bear to see disappointment in those amber eyes, couldn't stand to watch him realise that she wasn't worth the fight she was asking him to wage. "How reasonable," Vance purred, moving to take her arm with possessive familiarity. "Come, pet, let's return you to where you belong." As his fingers closed around her wrist like manacles, she felt the golden thread in her chest stretch thin, not breaking, but straining under the weight of reality and resignation. She belonged to Lord Vance, had always belonged to him, from the moment her father's signature dried on that terrible contract. Dreams of freedom, of being chosen and precious and worthy of love, were exactly that. Dreams. It was time to wake up. Chapter 4. The King's Claiming. The night of the grand summit ball arrived like an executioner's blade, swift, inevitable, and sharp enough to cut through every foolish dream Lyra had dared to nurture. She stood in her assigned position near the servants' entrance, wearing the same rough brown dress she'd arrived in days ago, watching Lord Vance parade through the glittering crowd in his finest silk and jewels. He'd made his point clear with cruel precision. She was property. She belonged to him, wore his collar, existed at his pleasure. The brief taste of luxury in King Kieran's guest chambers had been nothing more than a reminder of how far she'd fallen from grace, and how far she had yet to fall if she continued to entertain impossible fantasies about golden-eyed kings who looked at her like she mattered. "Stand straighter," Marcus hissed as he passed with a tray of champagne flutes. "Lord Vance wants you visible tonight, a reminder to certain interested parties about the natural order of things." Lyra's spine straightened automatically, years of training overriding the exhaustion that had settled into her bones. She hadn't slept in the 2 days since Vance had dragged her back to the servants' quarters. Every time she closed her eyes, she felt Kieran's hands framing her face, heard his voice calling her everything when she knew she was nothing. The golden thread in her chest had dimmed to a barely perceptible ache, like a candle guttering in the wind. She told herself it was for the best. Kings didn't fight wars over debt slaves, didn't bankrupt their treasuries to free women who weren't worth the cost of their chains. "You look pale," observed Lady Ashford's maid as she paused beside Lyra. "Are you feeling unwell?" "I'm perfectly fine," Lyra replied automatically. It was a lie, but lies were easier than explaining that her heart was breaking in slow motion while she watched the most powerful man in 7 kingdoms conduct political business as if their kiss had meant nothing at all. The ballroom doors opened with a flourish, and a herald's voice rang out over the crowd. "His Royal Majesty, King Kieran Blackwood of the Eastern Reaches, Protector of the 7 Kingdoms, Alpha of the ancient line." Lyra's breath caught despite every effort to remain unmoved. He entered the ballroom like controlled lightning given human form, dressed in midnight blue velvet that made his amber eyes burn like captured starlight. A silver circlet rested on his dark hair, and the ceremonial sword at his side caught the light of 1,000 candles. He was magnificent, untouchable, everything she could never be worthy of. Their eyes met across the vast expanse of silk and jewels and political manoeuvring, and for one impossible moment the golden thread blazed back to life. His expression was unreadable, but something in his gaze promised that this night was far from over. Then Lord Vance stepped into her line of sight, deliberately blocking her view of the king. "Remember your place, pet," he murmured, his breath hot against her ear. "Kings lose interest quickly when reality sets in, but I'll still be here when he grows bored with his latest obsession." The words were designed to cut, and they found their mark with surgical precision. She was an obsession, a temporary fascination that would fade as soon as Kieran returned to his kingdom and the weight of real responsibilities. "Yes, my lord," she whispered, because it was expected, because fighting would only make things worse. But as the evening progressed, she began to notice things that didn't align with Vance's cruel predictions. The way King Kieran's gaze kept finding her across the room, intense and possessive, even as he conducted conversations with visiting dignitaries. The way his jaw tightened every time Vance appeared near her, like a predator watching a rival circle his territory. The way he'd positioned himself strategically throughout the evening, never quite close enough to cause scandal, but near enough to intervene if needed. "Dance with me." The invitation came from Lord Ashford, one of Vance's political allies, and a man whose reputation with vulnerable women was whispered about in servants' halls. He extended a gloved hand with the kind of smile that made her skin crawl. "I'm honoured, my lord, but I'm not a guest," she replied carefully. "I'm here to serve." And I'm asking you to serve by providing me with a partner for this waltz." His grip closed around her wrist with just enough pressure to make refusal impossible. Surely even servants can follow simple instructions. Panic flared in her chest. Dancing meant being alone with him on the floor, away from witnesses, subject to whatever liberties he chose to take. But refusing would anger Vance, who was watching from across the room with calculating eyes. "I don't know how to dance, my lord," she tried desperately. "Then I'll teach you," Ashford purred, already pulling her toward the dance floor. "It's amazing what girls like you can learn when properly motivated." The threat in his voice was unmistakable. She was trapped between his unwelcome attention and Vance's expectation that she accommodate any request from his allies, no matter how uncomfortable it made her. But before Ashford could drag her onto the polished marble floor, a familiar voice cut through the noise like a blade. "Lord Ashford." King Kieran appeared beside them with the fluid grace of an apex predator, his presence so commanding that conversations around them simply stopped. The entire ballroom seemed to hold its breath as the most powerful alpha in 7 kingdoms fixed his attention on a minor lord who was suddenly sweating despite the cool evening air. "Your Majesty," Ashford stammered, releasing Lyra's wrist so quickly she stumbled. "You were just leaving," Kieran said softly. The words were spoken with perfect politeness, but there was something underneath them that made strong men step aside and weak ones flee entirely. Ashford took one look at the king's eyes, amber fire burning with barely controlled fury, and melted back into the crowd without another word. Kieran turned to Lyra, and when he offered his hand, she saw that his fingers were steady despite the tension radiating from every line of his body. "Dance with me," he said, and it wasn't a request. "Your Majesty, I don't know." "I'll teach you." His voice gentled, and suddenly she was looking at the man who'd called her everything instead of the king who commanded armies. "Trust me." Trust. Such a simple word, such a dangerous concept. But when he looked at her like that, like she was precious instead of worthless, like she mattered more than political convenience, she found herself placing her hand in his. The moment their skin touched, the golden thread blazed so brightly she gasped. Power flowed between them, ancient and undeniable, and she saw answering fire in his amber eyes. He led her onto the dance floor with infinite patience, one hand at her waist, the other cradling her fingers like they were made of spun glass. Around them, the crowd watched with a mixture of fascination and scandal as their king claimed a dance with a servant girl wearing rough brown wool among silks and jewels. "Follow my lead," he murmured, his breath warm against her ear. "Feel the music, feel my hands guiding you. You're safe with me." Safe. When was the last time anyone had promised her safety? They moved together with a grace that defied her inexperience, his strength supporting her through steps she'd never learned, but somehow knew. The rest of the ballroom faded to a blur of colour and sound as they spun in a bubble of perfect connection, 2 souls finding their rhythm despite every obstacle the world had placed between them. "You're beautiful," he said softly, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "I'm nobody," she replied automatically. "You're mine." The words were spoken with such quiet conviction that they hit her like a physical blow. "You've been mine since the moment I saw you, and I'm tired of pretending otherwise." Before she could respond, before she could remind him of all the reasons this was impossible, the music ended and Lord Vance's voice cut through their moment like a blade. "How touching," he said, his tone dripping with false warmth as he approached with several other lords in tow. "Though I confess myself confused about the appropriateness of our sovereign dancing with property that belongs to another man." The word property rang out across the suddenly silent ballroom like a slap. Conversations died mid-sentence as everyone turned to watch the confrontation unfold. Kings didn't dance with servants, especially not servants who belonged to other men through legal contract. "Property," Kieran repeated softly, and something in his tone made the nearby nobles take an instinctive step backward. "Is that what you think she is?" "It's what she is. Vance replied with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "As I'm sure you're aware, she's bound to my service by lawful contract until her father's debt is satisfied. 20,000 gold pieces, plus accumulated interest and penalties, a considerable sum." He was playing to the crowd, reminding everyone present of the financial burden attached to any interest in her, making them calculate whether she could possibly be worth such an enormous expense. "Considerable indeed," Kieran agreed mildly. "Tell me, Lord Vance, do you have this contract with you?" "But of course, Your Majesty." Vance produced a rolled parchment from his coat with theatrical flourish. "I always keep important documents close at hand." Kieran accepted the contract with calm politeness, his expression revealing nothing as he examined the terms. Around them, the crowd pressed closer, sensing drama that would be discussed for years to come. "Interesting," the king said finally. "This contract was signed under duress after your guards threatened physical harm to both the debtor and his daughter. It contains usury clauses that exceed legal limits in 4 kingdoms, and, most notably, it includes provisions for sexual services that violate the Covenant of Human Dignity ratified by all 7 kingdoms 3 years ago." Each word hit the room like a thunderclap. Contract slavery was one thing, distasteful but legal in some circumstances. Sexual bondage was quite another, forbidden by treaties that every lord present had sworn to uphold. Vance's face went pale. "Your Majesty misunderstands the terms. I understand them perfectly." Kieran's voice cut through the excuse with surgical precision. "This contract is not only morally repugnant, it's completely illegal." With casual grace, he extended his hand and let golden fire bloom around his fingers. The parchment caught flame instantly, burning to ash in seconds while the crowd watched in stunned silence. "The debt is void," he announced to the room. "The contract is null. The woman is free." Free. The word hit Lyra like lightning, impossible and terrifying and wonderful all at once. "You can't simply—" Vance began desperately. "I can," Kieran interrupted, "and I am." He turned to face the crowd, every inch the commanding monarch who ruled 7 kingdoms with absolute authority. "Let it be known that this woman is under my personal protection. Anyone who threatens her, harms her, or attempts to claim ownership over her will answer to me directly." The promise in his voice was unmistakable. Not just legal consequences, personal retaliation from the most dangerous alpha alive. But Lyra barely heard the crowd's murmur of shock and speculation. Her world had narrowed to the man standing before her, offering his hand with the same patience he'd shown when teaching her to dance. "The choice is yours," he said quietly, his words meant for her alone despite the watching crowd. "You can walk away from here free of all bonds, or—" He paused, and when he continued, his voice carried across the silent ballroom like a declaration of war. "You can stay with me. Stay with him. Choose him, as he was choosing her in front of witnesses who would spread the story to every corner of the 7 kingdoms, except that she might be worth fighting for after all." "I choose you," she whispered, placing her hand in his. The golden thread between them exploded into brilliant life, a bond so bright and strong that several people in the crowd gasped in recognition. Mate bond, soul bond, the connection that tied alpha hearts to their perfect matches across centuries of legend and song. "She is everything to me," Kieran announced to the room, his voice carrying absolute conviction. "My choice, my mate, my queen. Queen." The word echoed through the ballroom like a bell, and Lyra felt something inside her shift and settle into place. Not because a king had claimed her, but because she'd finally found the courage to claim herself. To believe that she deserved love, protection, and the golden warmth that came from being chosen by someone who saw her worth when she couldn't see it herself. "Not any more," she said softly, echoing the words that had started this impossible journey. "Not property, Not worthless, not alone. Everything. Chapter 5. The Healing Touch. The days that followed the ball were a strange mixture of wonder and terror, like learning to breathe underwater, or discovering that gravity worked differently when you were loved. Lyra found herself installed in the royal wing of the estate, in chambers that adjoined Kieran's own, a suite of rooms larger than any building she'd ever lived in, filled with silks and furs and windows that looked out over gardens instead of servant yards. But it wasn't the luxury that left her breathless. It was the man who brought her tea each morning with his own hands, who asked about her comfort as if her preferences mattered, who looked at her like she was something precious instead of something broken. "You don't have to serve me," she'd protested on the second morning, watching him pour hot water over delicate tea leaves with the same careful attention he probably gave to matters of state. "I'm not serving you," he'd replied with that devastating smile. "I'm caring for you. There's a difference." Caring for her, as if she was worth caring for, as if 3 years of believing herself worthless hadn't carved the truth of her insignificance into her very bones. Now, a week after the ball that had changed everything, she stood before a mirror in her dressing chamber while seamstresses fitted her for gowns that cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. The reflection looking back at her was almost unrecognisable, clean and well-fed, with colour in her cheeks and brightness in her eyes that hadn't been there since childhood. "The blue silk brings out your eyes beautifully, my lady," murmured Elena, the head seamstress who'd been assigned to outfit the future queen. "His Majesty will be pleased." My lady, future queen. Titles that felt like borrowed clothes, beautiful but not quite fitting yet. "Is it too much?" Lyra asked, running her fingers over fabric that felt like liquid starlight. "The expense, I mean. Surely something simpler would be more appropriate." Eleanor's face softened with understanding. "My lady, if I may speak freely." Lyra nodded. "I've been dressing noble ladies for 20 years, the seamstress said gently. "I've seen wives who wore crowns like prisons, daughters who draped themselves in gold to hide their emptiness, queens who collected jewels like armour against their own worthlessness. But you look at beauty like it's a gift instead of a burden. That's rarer than any silk." Before Lyra could respond, a familiar voice came from the doorway. "She's right, you know." Kieran leaned against the doorframe, his amber eyes warm with appreciation as they traced the lines of blue silk that transformed her from servant to something ethereal. He'd abandoned his formal royal attire for simple dark clothing, but even dressed down he commanded attention like a force of nature. "Your Majesty?" Elena curtsied quickly. "We were just finishing the fitting." "Take your time," he said, but his eyes never left Lyra's face. "I can wait." The seamstresses worked with renewed efficiency, making final adjustments while Lyra tried not to blush under Kieran's steady regard. When they finally departed with promises to have the gown ready by evening, she found herself alone with the man who'd upended her entire world with 2 simple words: "Not any more." "You look beautiful," he said softly, crossing the room to stand behind her. In the mirror they looked like something from a fairy tale. A king and his chosen queen, golden thread connecting their hearts across space and time. "I feel like I'm playing dress-up," she admitted, like a little girl trying on her mother's clothes. His hand settled on her shoulders, warm through the silk. What would help it feel real? The question surprised her with its gentleness. Most men would have dismissed her fears, told her to be grateful for what she'd been given. But Kieran seemed genuinely interested in understanding the confusion that had been building in her chest like a storm. "I don't know," she said honestly. "Everything happened so fast. One moment I was nobody, the next I'm supposedly going to be your queen. I keep waiting to wake up and find myself back in the servants' quarters." "Look at me." She turned in his arms, and the intensity in his amber eyes made her breath catch. He cupped her face with the same reverent care she'd noticed from the beginning, thumb tracing her cheekbone like she was made of precious metal. "You were never nobody," he said firmly. "You were always everything. You just hadn't found someone who could see it yet. But how can you be so certain? The question tumbled out before she could stop it. How do you know this isn't just fascination, an alpha's protective instinct towards someone who seemed helpless? Something fierce and possessive flashed in his eyes. Because I've felt protective toward many people over the years, and none of them made my soul catch fire every time they looked at me. None of them made me want to burn down kingdoms just to see them smile. His thumb moved to trace her lower lip, and the simple touch sent heat spiraling through her veins. The mate bond isn't just attraction, Lyra, it's recognition. My wolf knew you before my mind did, knew you were the other half of everything I am. The mate bond. She'd felt it from the beginning, that golden thread that tied her heart to his with supernatural strength. But accepting its reality meant accepting that she deserved such a connection, and that belief still felt fragile as spun glass. "I'm scared," she whispered. "Of what?" "Of not being enough, of disappointing you when the novelty wears off and you realise I don't know how to be a queen, of waking up one day and finding out this was all a beautiful dream." The confession hung between them like a bridge, and for a moment she wondered if she'd revealed too much. If admitting her fears would make him see the truth she'd been trying to hide, that she really wasn't worthy of the love he offered so freely. But instead of pulling away, he drew her closer until she could feel the steady beat of his heart against her chest. "Can I tell you a secret?" he murmured against her hair. She nodded. "I'm terrified too." The admission shocked her into stillness. "You? You're the most powerful alpha in 7 kingdoms. What could you possibly be afraid of?" "Losing you." His arms tightened around her. "Not to death or distance or political manoeuvring, but to your own certainty that you don't deserve to be loved. I'm afraid that no matter how many times I tell you you're everything, you'll still believe you're nothing." The raw honesty in his voice broke something open in her chest. He wasn't just offering her love, he was admitting that her acceptance of it mattered to him, that her belief in her own worth wasn't just important to her healing, but to his happiness. "I want to believe," she said quietly. "When you look at me like that, when you touch me like I'm precious, for those moments I almost do. Then let me keep looking, let me keep touching." His hands framed her face again, amber eyes burning with gentle determination. "Let me spend every day proving that you're worthy of love until you can't remember ever believing otherwise." Before she could respond, he was kissing her with the same reverent intensity that characterized everything he did, not demanding or taking, but offering and cherishing. The golden thread between them blazed to life, binding them together in a connection that felt ancient and unbreakable. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, she felt something settle into place in her chest. Not complete confidence, that would take time, but the beginning of belief. The first tentative acceptance that maybe, possibly, she could be worth the love he offered so freely. "I want to try," she said against his lips. "I want to learn how to be worthy of this." "You already are," he replied, pressing soft kisses to her forehead, her cheeks the tip of her nose. "You just need to learn how to see it." That evening they dined alone in his private chambers, a simple meal served by candlelight while rain drummed against the windows. No servants, no political obligations, no reminders of the vast gulf that had once separated their stations. Just a man and a woman sharing food and conversation like any couple learning the shape of their love. "Tell me about your childhood," he said, as she sampled wine that probably cost more than most people's houses. "Before your father's debts, before Vance, what was it like when you were happy?" The question caught her off guard. It had been so long since anyone had asked about her happiness, she'd almost forgotten it had ever existed. "My mother had a garden," she said slowly, memories surfacing like bubbles in champagne. "Nothing elaborate, just herbs and vegetables, but she made it beautiful. I used to help her tend it, and she'd tell me stories about the plants, which ones brought luck, which ones healed heartbreak, which ones could make someone fall in love." "Did you believe her? About the love potions?" Lyra smiled and felt something warm unfurl in her chest. Absolutely. I was convinced that if I could just find the right combination of herbs, I could make my father love my mother the way she deserved. And now? She met his eyes across the candle-lit table, seeing gold fire and infinite patience, and something that looked remarkably like adoration. Now I think maybe the best love doesn't need potions. Maybe it just needs two people brave enough to choose each other. His smile could have powered the sun. I couldn't agree more. Later, as they sat before the fire with her curled against his side, he asked the question she'd been both dreading and longing to hear. "Will you marry me?" The words hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility and promise, and the weight of dreams she'd never dared to dream. "Not because you're a king, and I'm supposed to be grateful," he continued, his voice rough with emotion. "Not because the mate bond demands it, or because it's politically expedient, but because I love you, Lyra, because you make me whole in ways I didn't know I was broken, because I want to spend every day for the rest of our lives proving that you're everything, everything, the word that had become their promise, their prayer, their truth." "Yes," she whispered, and felt the last walls around her heart crumble into dust. "Yes, I'll marry you." When he kissed her this time, it tasted like freedom, like choosing love over fear, hope over despair, connection over the safety of isolation, like coming home. Chapter 6. The Crown's Promise. 6 months later, Queen Lyra Blackwood stood before the great windows of the Eastern Palace, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of gold, and rose while her husband reviewed the morning reports at his desk. The transformation from debt slave to sovereign had been gradual and sometimes overwhelming, but moments like this, quiet domestic peace in the early hours before the kingdom demanded their attention, reminded her that fairy tales could become reality with patience and love. "The harvest reports from the western provinces are encouraging," Kieran said, without looking up from his correspondence. "Lord Marcus writes that this year's yield should be sufficient to establish the grain reserves you suggested." She turned from the window, still marvelling at the casual way he sought her opinion on matters of state. 6 months ago she believed herself fit only to serve wine and scrub floors. Now she helped govern 7 kingdoms, and her counsel was not only welcomed, but actively sought by the most powerful alpha in the realm. "What about the new contracts for indentured servants?" she asked, settling into the chair across from his desk. "Have the reforms been implemented in all territories?" His smile was warm with pride and affection. "Signed into law yesterday. No more lifetime bonds, no more contracts signed under duress, and mandatory oversight for all service agreements. Your legislation, Your Majesty, is already changing lives." Your Majesty, even after all these months, the title sometimes caught her off guard, but she was learning to wear it with the same natural grace that had attracted Kieran's attention in the first place, not as borrowed finery that didn't quite fit, but as recognition of who she'd always been beneath the chains and collars of her former life. "Good," she said simply, but satisfaction settled warm in her chest. Every law she'd helped craft, every protection she'd advocated for, was another step toward ensuring that no one else would suffer as she had, that no other young woman would believe herself worthless simply because circumstances had placed her in bonds. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts, and Elena appeared with an armload of silk and lace that could only mean one thing. "Your Majesty," the seamstress said, with a curtsy that still made Lyra slightly uncomfortable. "The final fitting for tomorrow's gown, if you please." Tomorrow, the first anniversary of the night Kieran had claimed her publicly, the date they'd chosen to hold their formal wedding ceremony. Not because they needed legal binding. That had happened quietly weeks after the summit, with only necessary witnesses and the ancient words that made her his queen in truth. But because Kieran had insisted she deserved a celebration worthy of their love, witnessed by allies and subjects who needed to see their queen claimed with joy instead of political necessity. "Of course," Lyra said, rising gracefully. The movement was natural now, confident in a way that would have seemed impossible during her years of servitude. "Kieran, will you—" "I'll be here," he said, understanding without explanation. "Take all the time you need." The fitting room had been prepared with the same attention to detail that characterized everything in their palace. Soft lighting, comfortable seating, and flowers from the gardens she'd helped design over the past months. As Elena and her assistants worked around her, adjusting seams and ensuring every fold of silk fell perfectly, Lyra found her thoughts drifting to the woman who'd stood trembling in Lord Vance's ballroom not so long ago. "You seem thoughtful today, Your Majesty," Elena observed as she pinned a section of intricate beadwork. "Happy thoughts, I hope." "Very happy," Lyra replied honestly. "I was just remembering how different things were a year ago." "And now?" She considered the question seriously. "Now I wake up every morning knowing I'm exactly where I belong, with someone who sees me clearly and loves what he sees, in a place where I can use my experiences to help others. It's not the life I expected, but it's better than anything I ever dared to dream." When the fitting was complete and the gown hung carefully in her dressing chamber like captured starlight, she returned to find Kieran exactly where she'd left him, though his attention had shifted from state business to a small velvet box that he turned over in his hands with uncharacteristic nervousness. "What's that?" she asked, settling beside him on the couch before the fireplace. "A gift," he said, but something in his tone suggested it was more than that. "For tomorrow, but also for today. For the woman you were when I found you, and the queen you've become." He opened the box to reveal a necklace unlike anything she'd ever seen. Not the heavy jewelled pieces favoured by most nobles, but something delicate and beautiful. A fine gold chain supporting a pendant shaped like intertwined threads, each one set with tiny diamonds that caught the light like captured stars. "The golden thread!" she breathed, understanding immediately. "The mate bond that connected us before we even spoke," he confirmed, lifting the necklace from its velvet nest. "I commissioned it from the finest craftsman in the kingdom, but the design, that came from my dreams, from the way it felt when I first saw you across that ballroom and knew my life was about to change completely." He fastened it around her throat with the same reverent care he'd shown since the beginning, and she felt the weight of it settle against her skin like a promise. Not heavy like the collar she'd worn for years, but grounding in the way that love could be, anchoring her to something beautiful instead of chaining her to something cruel. It's perfect," she said, touching the pendant with wondering fingers. "But you know you don't have to keep giving me things to prove your love. I believe you now." His smile was soft and devastating. "I don't give you gifts to prove anything. I give them because seeing you happy makes me happy. Because after 30 years of believing I'd never find my mate, I want to celebrate every day that I get to call you mine." Mine. The possessive word that had once terrified her now filled her with warmth and security. She was his, but not as property, as choice, as the other half of his soul freely given and joyfully received. "Dance with me," she said suddenly. "Here, now." He looked around the private sitting room with its comfortable furniture and complete lack of ballroom grandeur. "There's no music." "There's always music when I'm with you," she replied, standing and offering her hand the way he'd offered his that night when everything changed. "I can hear it in the way you say my name, in the way you look at me like I'm everything you ever wanted." He took her hand without hesitation, pulling her into his arms with fluid grace. They swayed together in the firelight, moving to a rhythm only they could hear, two souls finding their perfect harmony in the quiet sanctuary of their love. "Any regrets?" he asked softly, echoing the question he'd posed that first night when she'd agreed to stay with him. She thought about it seriously, reviewing the path that had led them here, the pain and fear and years of believing herself worthless, the terrifying leap of faith required to trust his love, the gradual healing that had transformed her from broken slave to confident queen. "Only one," she said finally. His arms tightened around her. "Tell me." I regret that it took me so long to believe I deserved this, that I wasted so many months thinking you'd change your mind or discover I wasn't worth fighting for." She pulled back to meet his amber eyes, seeing infinite patience and love burning there like eternal flames. "But even that regret is precious, because it reminds me how far I've travelled, how much I've grown." "You were always worth fighting for," he said fiercely. "Always worth loving. Always everything, even when you couldn't see it yourself. Everything. Their word, their promise, their truth that had survived doubt and fear and the weight of old wounds." "I love you," she said simply, and meant it with every fibre of her being. Not grateful love, not desperate love, but the deep, steady love of someone who knew herself to be cherished and chose to cherish in return. "I love you too," he replied, and bent to kiss her with the same gentle intensity that had characterized their entire courtship. "My queen, my mate, my everything." As they kissed in the golden firelight, surrounded by the quiet luxury of their private happiness, Lyra felt the last shadows of her old life fade completely. The woman who'd believed herself nothing was gone, replaced by someone who knew her own worth, not because a king had chosen her, but because she'd finally chosen herself. Tomorrow would bring ceremony and celebration, witnesses and formal vows that would bind them publicly in the eyes of 7 kingdoms. But tonight was theirs alone. A perfect moment of domestic bliss that needed no audience beyond their 2 hearts beating in synchrony. "Ready for tomorrow?" Kieran asked against her lips. "Ready for forever," she replied, and meant it completely. The golden thread that connected their souls pulsed with warm light, a bond that had survived chains and cruelty and the deep-seated belief that love was not meant for girls like her. Now it sang with the quiet joy of 2 people who had found their way home to each other despite every obstacle the world had placed in their path. She was no longer property, no longer nothing, no longer afraid. She was Queen Lyra Blackwood, beloved of the Alpha King, protector of the vulnerable, and author of her own destiny. She was exactly where she belonged, with exactly the person who saw her worth when she couldn't see it herself. She was everything, and that was exactly enough